Good afternoon. My name is Henry Dimbleby. I am the author of the National Food Strategy, which was an independent report to government on how we can improve our food system, and I am a non-executive director at Defra. The purpose of first of all, I had to apologize for being so casual. I had a wardrobe malfunction. I was given very kindly by Groundswell one of their tops, and I've been asked quite often where the loo is, so I'm very expert now. If you need any logistical help, I'm here for you. The topic of today's conversation is what can policymakers do to support regenerative agriculture, and we have a fantastic panel on this SEN debate on that. I'd like to say before we start, and I introduce these people, a little bit about the Conservative Environment Network, which I came across really when I started my work at Defra. I think that the people on the right of politics took longer, maybe, than they might have done to acknowledge the problems of climate change, not Margaret Thatcher, who was early, but climate change and biodiversity. I think the reason for that was that they seemed like, particularly climate change, like perfect socialist problems. If you were a socialist and you wanted to invent a problem to fit your ideology, a problem of climate change, which basically the solution to which seemed to be to shut down the economy, stop capitalism, was so perfect that people were very suspicious that actually it existed, and there was a lot of just blank denial. And what the Conservative Environment Network has done in working within the Conservative Party to create a narrative that now sees more than half of Tory MPs signed up to their manifesto is really extraordinary. It shows how part of solving problems in the world is not so much about the policy that we're going to talk about today, but also changing the narrative. And the Conservative Environment Network is a fantastic example of someone able to do that. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then they are going to speak, give an introductory statement for 3 minutes. I may ask 1 or 2 questions, but I'm then going to hand it over to the audience, because I know from yesterday that you will have lots of questions. If you were here during the Secretary of State's last appearance on this stage, I heard that things got a little unruly, and I'm going to be very firm on shouters. So we're going to keep it cordial, but challenging. So let's start with George Eustice, who's been MP for Camborne and Redruth since 2010, and he's been working within Defra as a minister and then Secretary of State for 7 years. He is the scourge of civil servants because he knows more than anyone else working in Defra about farming and about Defra policy. And so people have to be on their toes when they go to see him. I'd like to say one personal thing about George, which is, having worked with him closely, I believe that he really has a very strong vision for how the farming transition can come about and what policy is needed to support that. But he is restricted in the context of being a politician and the political environment, sometimes from saying as much as he'd like to about that, but also he can't always just click his fingers and put in place the policies that he wants to. There's quite a lot of negotiation across government. Next to him, we have Ian Davis, who is he tells me, just retired from managing suckler cattle in Hertfordshire and has bought a house in Scotland. He was a specialist on flooding for the EA. He's on the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management and is on the Natural Capital panel there. Next to him, we have Ruth Edwards, who is MP for Rushcliffe in Nottinghamshire since 2019. She has been a leading advocate in Parliament, fighting to prevent deforestation, to enable us to have a very ambitious global oceans treaty. And then on the far end, we have Oliver Heald, who's been the MP for North Hertfordshire since 1992, our local MP here. He's a barrister, former Solicitor General, and was one of the founder members for SEN, one of the first people to join the caucus. Secretary of State, I'm going to ask you, first of all, what is you've described today some of the policies that are coming in the Sustainable Farming Initiative, integrated pest management. What is your long-term vision for the farming system and the future of regenerative farming within that?
I think that the heart of it is to get to a point where we learn and discover that successful, profitable, resilient agriculture goes hand in hand with our environmental objectives and a recovery of nature in particular. And I've had this view always that we probably took a wrong turn in the post-war years in around the 60s, where we got into this mindset of thinking that to increase your production, you were in a kind of war against nature. And I think what we're increasingly discovering is that that's not the case, and that we can indeed have sustainable agriculture and also successful, profitable food production. And so all of the policies we've got are about supporting that, perhaps more regenerative approach to agriculture. I'd also like to see a situation where it might be easier for new entrants to come onto the land, to get access to land and set up their own business. The truth about subsidies for land ownership is it tends to entrench support and entrench an existing system, and so it's actually prevented the new people getting access to land and less land coming to market. And the land area subsidies that we've had have probably inflated land rents as well. Some evidence that around half of that disappeared in inflated land rents. So I think I would like to get to the point that we, as I said, have that more regenerative approach where environmental recovery and successful agriculture go hand in hand, and actually a point where in 10 years' time the rest of the world wants to come to the UK to see how it was done, because it becomes the model that the rest of the world seeks to follow.
And do you have, there's been a lot of debate recently after the publication of the National Food Strategy about, and I was asked questions on it in my debate, about the kind of split of sustainable farming initiative, how much will be local nature recovery, how much low yielding land will take largely out of production in terms of landscape recovery. Could you give people a sense of, if you're looking across the countryside in 10 years' time, what it might look like?
Well, we're going to, as you know, and you recommended it, and we've taken up that recommendation, have a land use strategy that looks at this in more detail. But the point that I've been making consistently over the last couple of years is there's no direct correlation between the land that's farmed, the area of land farmed, and our agricultural output. We've got some, for instance, around a third of our agricultural output comes from intensive sectors such as pigs and poultry and horticulture in particular, and that doesn't use very much land at all. In fact, some of those sectors only use about 4% of land. You've then got a situation where around 60% of agricultural output comes from about a third of your land. And at the other end of the scale, if you look at the most marginal 10% of land in those landscapes, its food production, its contribution to national food production is quite low, only sort of 2 or 3%. So it's entirely possible, in my view, to have that sustainable intensification of agricultural output. It's why our food strategy committed to a whole new generation of glasshouses and horticulture so that we can increase our production in areas like salads, where currently we import more than we need to from countries like the Netherlands, where you can have a slightly more extensive but more resilient approach to farming in other landscapes with more pasture-based livestock and so forth. And then where you could, at the other end of the scale, have some land use change and do all of that while maintaining successful food production.
Thank you. Ian, you're both a practitioner, or were until very recently, and also you've been an advisor and expert, particularly in flooding, but also you're on various collectives and nature corridors. The answer to the literal question, what can policymakers do to support regenerative agriculture in your view?
It's a difficult one. Regenerative agriculture, the transition from what we would now call conventional agriculture to regenerative agriculture invariably involves a transition period, much the same as conversion to organic agriculture does, during which there is a significant risk of a drop in output, and therefore there's a financial gap to bridge whilst making that transition. You either transit quickly and see a loss of income that then recovers as the function of the soils and the biodiversity of the farm picks up, or you extend it over a very long period of time and go very, very slowly in how you make the change. And I have to say, at the moment, I'm struggling to see how that transition is really being supported by some of the options that are being offered, particularly under the SFI. I'm also a bit concerned that the prescriptions that are being offered at the moment are capable of being followed to the letter without necessarily delivering the benefits that they're intended to deliver. The difficulty, as we were discussing yesterday morning in our regenerative journey, it's about changing the mindset of how you manage it rather than just changing the practices, and it's why you do things that makes the difference. And from that point of view, it's hard really to see quite how the policy is going to support it.
Thank you. I'm going to give the Secretary of State a chance to respond to that in a second, but I'm going to come now to Ruth Edwards. Ruth, you obviously have a constituency. We're here now with a lot of people, presumably, who are quite keen on regenerative farming. You have a lot of farmers in your constituency. We're seeing at the moment debates about whether the programme, even the SFI, should be delayed, whether we should go back to basic payments. How do you see things from your farming constituents' perspective?
Thanks, Henry. So in Rushcliffe, we've got many farmers who've long been part of schemes like the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, which will obviously be succeeded by the Nature Recovery Scheme. And a lot of people there practicing some regenerative techniques at the moment. But I have to say, when we talk about sort of the ELM scheme and what we're trying to do with public support for public goods and moving to more a regenerative approach, I don't think the mindset that George described from the 60s, that nature, food production and environmentalism always have to butt heads, I don't think that's gone away. It's definitely gone away in government policy. It's great to be here today where, you know, we're with like-minded people. There's fascinating stalls all over the place. But I think out there in the world, out there in my constituency in Rushcliffe, we are met with a lot of fear about what we're trying to do. So I have quarterly farmers' forums in an attempt to try and, you know, increase communication between government and farmers in Rushcliffe. I had Victoria Prentice, one of George's ministers, up the other week, who is a fantastic communicator and able to talk through what we're doing. But I regularly hear that, you know, the government is more interested in planting trees than in food production. I hear that you know, good, productive agricultural land is going to be taken out of food production, and it's all going to be rewilded, and we're all going to have to eat trees. And you know, that, in my mind, is not what we are trying to do. And I'm thinking, but you're reading the same thing that I am. How have you possibly come to this conclusion? Because I don't think that is what the government is trying to do at all. I think we're trying to support a much bigger uptake of regenerative farming on productive farmland. On land that isn't productive, as George has set out, we're looking at how we can you know, restore biodiversity, which is another huge issue that we have to tackle. Yes, okay, we can't eat trees, but they're pretty helpful if you want to breathe, so we've got to get that balance. But I do think we really do need to take account of the fear that massive change brings to people. Very understandable massive change. I come from a completely different sector, from the tech sector. I used to work in BT and cybersecurity, but the huge changes happening there to people in networks, seeing lots of disruption with new technology being adopted. We have to really think about how we can break that fear down and get people on board with us, I think.
Thank you. Oliver, you have been a champion of nature-based solutions for a long time now. How do you think the vision that the Secretary of State just described matches up with where you think we need to be, and how pleased are you with progress that we've seen so far?
I think, first of all, can I just welcome everybody to North East Hertfordshire, my wonderful constituency, and particularly to this farm, which is very important, I think, in terms of the journey we're coming on with regenerative farming. It was about 2010, I think, that John Cherry took me out on the farm and showed me what he wanted to do. And he was talking about not tilling the soil, not putting very much fertilizer on, putting on these cover crops and fixing nitrogen in that way. And I must say, I was a bit doubtful because nobody else was really suggesting that. But you know, 2 or 3 years later, he took me around again, and he was absolutely thrilled with what the worms were doing with the soil, you know, really improving the quality of it, and his yields were back up. And it was really following on from that I just got to this idea, which I think a lot of us have got to, that nature is providing us with the tools, and we should have forgotten that for a period as we did at one time. So I think this is something that George really gets, and I think his policies are designed to build on the sort of experiences that farmers like the Cherries here have had. And if you look at something like the Sustainable Farming Incentive, I mean, it does incentivize those crops which provide the nitrogen-fixing properties to the soil. And something like that, you know, is very much key to this program. I mean, I personally would like us to go further and to see trading in carbon units. And I think I don't know if you saw the demonstration earlier, but there are ways now of sampling the soil in order to discover to what extent it is sequestering carbon. And that should be something that can be traded, and that would provide a further income stream to the farmers who want to follow this route. And, you know, I'm looking at this audience as a farming audience, but if you think about so many other areas, and one of the reasons that I helped to found the Parliamentary Caucus was because if you look at what happens to our chalk streams in this area, there are 8 chalk streams in this area. You know, they were being over-abstracted, they were getting soil erosion going into them, spoiling them, and the meanders had been removed. You know, there was a lot of things happening which were damaging what is a very precious ecological resource in this part of the world, and something that's very much valued by the public. And so I started to campaign on that as well, and I think, you know, the Conservative Environment Network doesn't come from the left-wing point of view, as Henry was saying. And if you go out in these stalls, you'll see numerous businesses that have come up because they're trying to tackle this challenge, but they're full of innovation and they are businesses. It's not just a government effort. So I think George has made a good start.
Thank you. Secretary, Ian said something quite interesting. The challenge, which strikes me as there are many balancing acts that you're going to have to pull off as you deliver this policy. One of them is you're simultaneously trying to make the policy less bureaucratic, more accessible, easier for farmers to access. And yet Ian raised the question, how do you do that? How do you remove the bureaucracy, but actually still make sure it has teeth and still make sure it gives us, the taxpayer, value for money?
Yeah, I think it is possible, but it is a balancing act, as you say. I mean, the first thing I'd say is we've made way more progress than most people realize, in that, as I said earlier, we now have 31,000 farmers in countryside stewardship in some form or another. And that represents around 40% of BPS claimants and close to half of the agricultural land in England already in schemes. So farmers are already moving into this. There was a 40% increase in demand last year. We've increased payment rates this year by 30% for some of the keystone options, and that's driving more interest. And it may be that some farmers will say, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it in a slightly more comprehensive way than just doing the first level of the SFI, so they can go into countryside stewardship. And if they choose to do that, that's fine. In fact, we've designed it that way, so that those who want to move faster can move faster through the vehicle of countryside stewardship, and that those can then be automatically converted into future schemes. Now, others may think, well, actually, I do some good work on soil health, or I could do more in this area. Green cover crops is a good option. I'm going to go for the SFI, and that would also be fine. The other thing to bear in mind is, in terms of the payment rates, yeah, people can get up to about £50 per hectare for the higher level tier on the sustainable farming incentive. Some would say that's a smallish amount of money, but if you think back to the ELS scheme, where we had around 70% of farmers participating, that was a scheme that had its faults, yes, but 70% got involved, and that was only paying, I think, something like £20 per hectare for farmers to be involved. So I think the truth, we will find out. I'm relaxed if people choose to do countryside stewardship rather than the SFI in the meantime, but we've deliberately offered people both options. And then in terms of your point around the control regime, the truth is that the sort of IAC-style regulatory regime that permeated everything in the sort of EU days was what drove a lot of nonsense. And when we had the freedom, and we did have some freedom, when we had the freedom to innovate in those Pillar 2 schemes, we actually did some quite useful, interesting things. And in fact, in the early days, the reason that countryside stewardship had problems is that the EU had imported the IACS system of governance into the Pillar 2 schemes, and that restricted things unnecessarily. So I think if you can basically give some trust to an individual farmer and an advisor, a natural England advisor locally, to be able to diverge from the sort of set menu in order to do something that will work on an individual farm, you'll get the right sorts of outcomes. And the example I give, it's a bit like your tax return. It's built on trust. You fill out your tax return, and the government has to trust that people are honest. And if there are people out there that are less than honest or tempted not to be honest, well, then they always have the threat that there could be, at some point, an investigation and someone could go back 6 years, and that'll be quite a problem. And so generally speaking, although someone doesn't come and check every single tax return down to the last bit of detail, there's a system of trust backed up with a proper sort of intelligence-led surveillance process, and that kind of works. And we've got to get to the same sort of space on these schemes, that it's built on trust, but recognizing that you'll need some kind of surveillance as well, but not try to manage every last bit of detail that happens on every last scheme, on every last field.
I'll come to that in a second. Just one quick question on that. With the government looking to reduce the number of civil service by 20 to 40%, are you going to be able to provide enough advisors to talk to every farmer in the country and take them through those plans?
Yes, we will. In that we've always had as a longer term objective that we could move to a system, and not doing it initially because the risk would be too great, but in the medium term move to an approach where a land agent or the wildlife trusts or RSPB or FWAG could become effectively accreditors for the scheme and could actually walk the farm with the farmer, help them put together a scheme, verify that it suits the scheme rules, and for them to almost, coming back to my original thing, to be a bit like the accountant or the auditor that again audits something as being compliant with the scheme rules. And if it's audited as such and they're accredited to do that audit, well, then there would be a very strong presumption that it would go through. So I think there's some quite interesting things we could do using third sector organisations or indeed commercial land agents, many of whom do this sort of work with these schemes already, to specialise and actually become accreditors for the scheme, so that we can upscale that kind of bespoke advice around the kitchen table and do that in quite a big way.
Thank you. Now, Oliver wants to speak. I'm going to let Ian say whether he thinks that answers his concerns. I'm then going to come to the audience. If you could start to put your hands up so that the microphones can find you, just know roughly where you are. That would be good. They can see you. Oliver and then Ian.
Well, I just wanted to say that a lot of farmers are telling me their costs, their inputs, are really going up fast at the moment, and particularly for things like fertiliser and fuel. And of course, one of the strengths of regenerative farming is that nature, the sun, does the work for you to some extent. And so I wonder if the economics of this aren't changing, and that actually regenerative agriculture is becoming a bit more of a no-brainer.
Ian, were you satisfied by the answer on SFI?
There's two particular words I found interesting that Secretary of State used, and those were trust and advisors. Trust is fundamentally lacking between the farming industry in England and the RPA in particular, but the wider Defra body in general. I know that Janet Hughes has done an awful lot of work to try and rebuild that trust, and the efforts are being made, but we're starting from a very, very low base from that point of view, with lots of people having waited very long times for funds for countryside stewardship schemes and various other subsidies. And that's going to colour a lot of farms' approach to joining SFI and to how ready they are to fully adopt the money that's on offer. And then advisors, anyone who's spoken to me in the last 12 months will know that I have a serious concern about the whole issue of trusted advisors. We're effectively expecting the commercial industry that's provided the agricultural advice that's got our environment into the situation that it's in now to pivot and start providing the best of regenerative advice from here. And I'm not sure that they're the right people to do that. I think events like today are a huge step in the right direction. I think there are companies out there who can help. I myself did the holistic training course with 3LM, the UK Savoury Hub, and people like them are part of the solution. I have a huge amount of time for agroecology and some of the other third sector organisations that are working in this field, but I have serious concerns about the fitness of the conventional advice industry to be advising farmers on regenerative matters, let alone actually certifying that farms have become regenerative. Certainly at the moment, it may well be that over the next 5 to 10 years they develop that skill set, but my experience over the last 30 years has been that they're the wrong people to be doing that.
Okay, I think we'll come back to Secretary for his views on that, but I think we're about to the microphones. There's one over there.
Question for George Eustice. So I'm sure you've probably seen that New Zealand talking about introducing a carbon tax for farmers. It's been a farmer-led scheme so far about trying to reduce their carbon emissions. Do you think that's something that the UK government will be starting to look at in the future, or are you not going down that route?
We are doing a piece of work, yes, on emissions trading schemes. We've chosen initially to keep agriculture outside of that scheme. And the real reason for that is we are doing something very different in New Zealand. We are repurposing a very significant agricultural support budget. And we think that gives us the tools that we need, for now to move in that direction. But yes, there is work going on. It's longer term work between BEIS and Treasury around carbon emissions trading. And obviously linked to that, if you introduce such a scheme or a system, you'd also need to have a carbon border adjustment tax. So that's being explored, but it's more of a medium to longer term approach. And we don't think we need it just now. It would just be an added complexity to the landscape.
Anyone else have strong views on carbon taxes, or should we go on to the next question? Is it possible to get 2 microphones so we can take a couple of questions at a time? So we'll take these 2 questions together. So first here and then here, and then we'll answer them together.
Henry, can I just make one comment about that? The New Zealand initiative is really interesting for 2 points. In particular, they have recognised the difference between methane and other gases. And that's fundamental part of the trading system that they're bringing in. Now, I, along with all of New Zealand's agriculture, have concerns about the way they're implementing it, but at least they have actually recognised the fundamental difference between a short-lived climate pollutant and gases like CO2. The taxing of the industry, I also have serious concerns about in New Zealand, given that the most polluting industries in New Zealand, like Air New Zealand and the steel industry, have been given 90% discounts on their emissions trades. So it's very far from an even playing field, and it's certainly not something that I would like to see the UK looking to mirror.
Thank you. So we'll take the question here and over there together. This one first, and then that one.
Thank you. Margaret Thatcher wrongly believed that free market capitalism would self-regulate and save us from climate change and nature degradation. And now we see huge tracts of land passing into private capital management. And with all the associated risks of maladaptation, control of our food supplies, nature access, and wealth distribution, do wealthy individuals and big business have too large a voice in influencing policy and mainstream media, so the messaging around policy? And have we forgotten that we're citizens, not consumers?
Thank you. And this question over here?
Thank you very much. The title of this session was What Can Policymakers Do? And I don't believe that Defra can solve the food and farming and nature recovery all by itself, all by its own policies. Is it possible, Secretary of State, for you to persuade the other major government departments and influence their policies? And I've thought of an example. Could you persuade, for instance, the policies in the Ministry for Education that they put food and farming and nature recovery at the heart of educational curriculum?
Thank you. So we've got two questions. I'm going to take the first one. I take the first one first. So there's a lot of concern that we basically go from a system where we're paying basic payments to rich landlords, and we'll end up paying a large amount of money to rich landlords to make their estates look attractive and have lots of nature in them, and effectively the money will still be captured. And particularly people have concern about the way that green finance might soak up government payment subsidies. Oliver, do you have a view on that?
Well, first of all, I noticed that Margaret Thatcher was mentioned, and it's worth remembering that she was the first world leader to really tackle this subject when she made a really important speech at the UN. And she was making the point that we have a leasehold on the planet, not a freehold, and that we should respect the environment and work hard to protect it. So I think she had her instincts on this as a chemist and a lawyer were right. Having said that, I do think it's important that everybody in the country should be able to play their part in tackling this systemic challenge to mankind. And so I think it's right that we can encourage the ordinary citizen to do, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's perhaps having a solar panel, whether it's helping to tackle some of these issues in very many different ways. You know, I think we should all be involved. But having said that, you can't ignore the fact that businesses are capable of being very innovative, coming up with ideas like that test for a core of soil and whether, you know, the extent to which it's sequestering carbon. I mean, that's something which a business has developed. And I think that we do need to, respect that business has its place, that every citizen can do something to help with this, and also that government has its role in setting the parameters. But I don't think we want to get too party political about this. This is a battle for all of us.
Sorry, Ruth, you want to say something on that?
Well, I'd just like to back Oliver up on this. I think we have to get real, right? We need to redirect not just public funding towards policies that regenerate the environment, but private sector funding as well. Because at the moment, there is far too much public and private sector funding all over the world going into policies that exploit nature. And we're not going to get there without bringing the private sector along with us. So I think there's some fantastic initiatives at the moment. I know we've got the Financing Nature Recovery Commission, which is being led by Lord Bennion, who've had some really interesting ideas about how we can build markets for carbon sequestration, for water quality, and also for biodiversity as well. And there's some brilliant case studies of what's going on with restoring peatland in the Scottish Highlands, with a great catchment area down in Avon and Somerset that loads of different private businesses are buying into and funding fantastic restoration throughout the country. I'd also just like to agree with the lady over there on the left who said that Defra, marvellous as it is, George, cannot solve all problems by itself. And I completely agree that we need to work cross-government to promote these kind of policies and the approach to agriculture as well. One of the biggest concerns I have when I meet farmers in Rushcliffe, that I hear from them, is that people don't think about agriculture as a career. People aren't taught about it in school. They're not taught about our relationship with food and nature. So I think it's really important that we do more to promote the huge range of diverse careers you can have in agriculture. And I was really pleased to hear about the institute around horticulture and everything like that was announced with the food strategy last week.
Secretary of State, to this question over here, I mean, being honest, it's a living hell, isn't it, trying to get other departments to do what you want them to do. And you can invest an enormous amount of time and energy talking to Department for Trade or to Education or even to Number 10. but in the end, you don't have control.
Well, collective government is what it is. And yes, of course, Henry, as you know, that there will sometimes be frustrations, but I would say that as a department that's bringing forward a policy agenda on agriculture and on environmental targets and so on, yes, of course, some departments will raise questions and concerns, but generally the initiative is with us. And Defra is actually very successful at dealing and overturning any opposition there might be from other government departments. So, yeah, of course, it takes a lot of work, but that's what government's like. Trying to get a collective position on any type of policy has its challenges. It was ever thus under governments of all shades throughout time. But it is something you have to just roll your sleeves up and work through, deal with differences. And I actually think we've got quite a bold agenda on agriculture over the next 7 years, and we're making some very good progress with it.
Thank you. We're going to take the next two questions. After those, there are two over here. There's a gentleman here I'd like to take, and a gentleman here, and then I'd like to hear from Martin as well. But let's take these next two.
Thank you. The government has committed to consulting on a carbon border tariff adjustment, and I just wonder whether, given that it's going to be hard to make that distinguish between regenerative farming and conventional farming in terms of the carbon border adjustment, and that doesn't include the impact of farming on nature, so that farmers in this country could be undercut by imports of lower standard food products. What can policymakers do to have a more holistic view of addressing that trade issue?
Thank you. And the other mic?
Hello.
Goodness, hello.
So carbon credits have been mentioned. Are people aware that in order to certify a carbon credit, it has to be proved to be additional, which means that you're not being paid to do it by another fund? So if SFI is covering every regenerative practice, then it's going to make it more difficult for farmers to claim additionality. So is that being considered in SFI, that some practices need to be remained which can be additional for carbon credits? Are you going to work with the carbon market to work that out?
Thank you. So on the first question, the version of the government food strategy that was leaked in The Guardian and The Times had some quite strong wording on trade and on what we might do at the border, and that didn't appear in the final version. We've talked about negotiations with other government departments. Is it possible that through a carbon border tax that might look at modes of production, might move on to biodiversity, that the government might find a solution to that trade issue?
I think the first thing to say is the policy that we have, and there's two ways you could, and there will be people in some departments who say just jack up the regulatory baseline to achieve your environmental outcomes. And then you would be putting yourselves at a disadvantage. But we're doing something quite different. We're saying we're going to change the way we pay farmers and landowners. So we're going to remove a subsidy for land ownership, which is essentially what we have now, which makes no sense at all, because it means the vast majority of the money goes to some of the wealthiest landowners in the country. And we're going to change it so that we're actually rewarding farmers for farming sustainably and paying them to do that, and paying them in such a way that it's not only just covering their costs in the old income foregone methodology, but gives them a margin as well. So doing the right thing implies a profit margin for doing the right thing, and that's what makes it different, and that's why the new schemes aren't putting farmers at a competitive disadvantage. And then there's the wider question around, long term. If we do the right thing and we take difficult decisions to reduce carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane, what about the freeloaders in the world that don't? At that stage, you definitely, yes, need something like a carbon border adjustment tax. In the meantime, we have a good proxy for that, which is a tariff system. And what we should be doing in the meantime, obviously, is being willing to deploy those tariffs in an ethical way to ensure that it enables us to take account of differences in standards when it comes in particular to animal welfare, but also the environment as well.
I'm going to move on to the other members of the panel. Just quickly on this question of double counting. So I hear this from both sides. So I hear concerns about people being paid from the environmental side, about people being paid 3 times for the same carbon. And I hear concerns from people who are trying to set up green finance that if the government comes in too strongly, it will actually make it difficult for the private sector to get involved and will limit the amount of money thrown at that. How do you deal with this question, both about double counting and about letting the right kind of market be established?
So we're looking at this around the concept of blended finance, which is that it would be possible to have some of the finance coming from, on some measures, some of the finance coming from a government scheme, and for that to be topped up by other private capital as well. So we're looking at some of these options around blended finance. But fundamentally, obviously, nobody wants to pay for something twice. Otherwise, somebody is being taken for a ride. Either the government's paying for something that the market would reward, or the market's paying for something that's happening anyway. And that obviously doesn't make sense. So we do need to think a bit about this. I suspect that where we will end up is that this will become less of a challenge than some fear, in that certain interventions, particularly on the sustainable farming incentive and local nature recovery, will lend themselves quite well to government-backed schemes that reward people positively for doing those things. At the other end, some of that land use change, woodland creation, peatland restoration, where you've got a more fundamental land use change, I can see that in the medium to long term, that area will become largely financed by private money. And if it does, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter where the money's coming from, as long as people are properly rewarded for the things that they're doing. So I think this will settle down, but there will be an overlap, and there will be areas where we need to look at this concept of blended finance, and we've got groups doing precisely that.
Would you advise farmers who are being offered all sorts of schemes now to set aside some of their land for carbon, to be careful about what they go into? Do you think there's a risk that farmers at the moment are jumping into schemes that actually are not going to be attractive for them in the long run to compare with what's going to be announced in the future?
Yes, I think what I've said is farmers should get legal advice. And I know I'm famously not a huge fan of lawyers, but in a situation like this, where you have an embryonic market with lots of uncertainty and with some questions around integrity and different people saying different things, it's one of those areas where getting the right legal advice and making sure that you don't fetter your hand too much, or making sure you've got exit provisions should you decide that what you've gone into isn't working and you need to renegotiate. It's going to be very important to be able to do that.
Ian.
I have huge concerns about the whole issues around offsetting. I would like to step back a stage and say what we're actually trying to achieve is a change in corporate approach, particularly corporate approach, that has got us into the situation we're in now. The ecological situation and the climate situation that we're in has been a failure of market forces because we've failed to price in all of the things that economists have traditionally classed as externalities. And the question about the double funding is an interesting one, because it's debatable what the true cost of a carbon offset should be in the first place. We're in a situation where the only truly robust carbon drawdown system that I'm aware of at the moment is Carbon Plan in Iceland, who are looking at something like £1,000 a tonne for carbon to provide geological secure long-term storage, which would actually meet our needs. And at the other extreme, we've got supposed carbon offsets for flights and things like that that are down around the sort of high teens, low 20s per tonne, but have very, very weak evidence about their effectiveness and their security. Now, agriculture does have the potential to sequester large amounts of carbon additionally into the soil. There's an awful lot of uncertainty about that at the moment, and as I see it, there are a lot of free market organisations who are stepping forward and offering to mediate that process purely for the financial benefit of themselves, for the handling charge that they're going to impose on it, and unless the cost of that offset is sufficiently high to actually drive change in culture within the organisations that are buying the offsets, then it's not achieving the purpose we're looking for in the first place.
To all of you, do you think the government's doing enough to regulate the carbon offset market at the moment?
I think it's important that the science is clear, and I know this is something that I've heard discussed a lot in this tent in the past, but it is important that there are ways of being sure that extra carbon is being sequestered and that it's not just paying money for something that happens anyway. And I think that's true of quite a range of offsetting propositions. And if we can find organisations which are able to broker the offsets which are clearly rigorous in what they do, then that is obviously very important. And you know, I think with forestry, the Forestry Commission are now doing quite a lot of this, and it may be that in the world of agriculture there are other ways of doing it. But I still think it's an enormously positive thing if the economics are that if you look after nature and tackle the issue of carbon, you get rewarded rather than what's been happening previously. So I do think it's important to get the precision. But I think the government is trying hard on this, and I mean, I don't know if George has any further comments on it, but it isn't an easy one. It's an early stage, really, in this whole process.
I mean, if I am, the government, for example, is now pretty tight. If I try and sell horse meat in a burger instead of beef, there's a whole organisation, the FSA, that's going to come down on me like a ton of bricks. We've gone massive on food fraud, really on carbon fraud. Are we? Is it easy for me to sell carbon offsets and get away with it, or will I be? Who's going to arrest me? Who's going to come and knock on my door and take me away?
So we're doing quite a bit of work in this area. So it's a new embryonic market that obviously at some point will need some regulation to bring some consistency and integrity to it. It's an emerging market at the moment, largely driven by voluntary ESG money coming from companies who want to send the right kind of signal, a bit like corporate social responsibility funds. But the Treasury are working on what they call the green taxonomy, which is basically quite clear definitions around what certain things are and what could be expected. There's a piece of work there, and Richard Benyon at the moment is doing a detailed piece of work for us on this whole issue around green finance. We already are involved with and have backed a carbon code for woodland, and that's recently been revised. It's something we've been working on with the Woodland Trust. So there is something there as a starting point when it comes to trees. We would need similar codes in other areas as well, and probably the woodland code over time will continue to need to be refined. But we've made some initial steps in this area, but it is something that's developing obviously at pace. And the key thing is to sort of properly understand it before you come in with a regulation. Otherwise, you might have an inappropriate regulation that snuffs out something that could actually be an important part of the answer.
We've got three more questions. Can we take a question here, and then with the same microphone, there's a guy in a blue shirt next to the gentleman with the cap in the blue shirt there, and take that with the same mic, and then we'll go with the third question from the mic, and then actually we've take four, so with the other mic we'll go to Martin down here who's had his hand up from the beginning. So two from this mic and two from the other mic.
Hello, yeah, Mr. Angry from Oxfordshire, but I'm on my best behaviour now, I promise, Henry. Tom Allen Stevens, I lead the British On-Farm Innovation Network, and it's farmer-led innovation I'd like to ask you about, Minister. First of all, thank you very much for all you have done in this area. We've really felt a change of emphasis at a research level, at a knowledge exchange level, and at a farm level towards farmer-led innovation, which is really heartening for those on-farm innovators. Thank you also for the Precision Breeding Technologies Bill, which is a very bold and decisive move, and history will thank you for it, and it's really good to see. But when it comes to accessing the funding, the rhetoric's all there, but the actual access isn't. And as farmer innovators, we find it really difficult to access those funds that should be available to us. We're being told it's outside the scope and to wait for accelerating adoption, which is supposed to come in this autumn, and the discussions haven't even started yet. We're there, we're ready to deliver that innovation that you want to see on farm. It's all there, it's all ready and waiting just for you to get things going. You're the Secretary of State. You can do it. You can just go back to Whitehall and say, that accelerating adoption thing, let's accelerate its adoption. Will you?
Thank you. And then to the gentleman here.
Thank you, again to the Secretary of State. The transition that we're going through also involves not only rethinking systems, but rethinking resource use and rethinking energy. And I think there's an understated ability of farms to generate their own energy for their own use in future. And can I ask you, perhaps, I know it's difficult dealing between government departments, but can Defra and the DFT together look at future fuels for farming, replacing red diesel potentially, not only with electric fuels, but also gas fuels?
Thank you. And then the other microphone is here. Oh, look, very close to here, the gentleman here.
Thank you. Personally, I'm going back in time a bit. My father took out hedges in the 60s and obviously got paid for it. My sons are putting hedges back where the other ones came out in the 20s. Seems a bit odd, so does nature pay? But the other point that I've heard 2 or 3 times today, being a pig farmer, you're saying that the chicken and pig industry are only taking 3 or 4% with the vegetables. Are you including all the grain that the monogastrics eat? I'm assuming not.
And then the question here from just the gentleman in the blue, just this gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Yeah, thank you. Martin Lyons, mixed farmer in Cambridgeshire and UK chair for the Nature Friendly Farming Network. We hear a lot about the farmers who are not here. The majority are not turning up to these kind of events, and they're up with the concern around mindset change. Do you think public money for public goods policy will drive that mindset change? And would attending farmer-led knowledge transfer events be part of receiving public money to drive a bottom-up approach and helping farmers see reality of a different approach on the ground?
Thank you. So I'm actually I'm gonna put that last question first to you, Ruth. So we had a question earlier on. You were talking about, you can't eat butterflies. How do we draw in the wider farming network? How do we actually resolve the problem that people see the same thing and take very different implications from it?
Yeah, well, it's actually, despite all the conversations we're having here about what are difficult technical schemes like carbon offsetting, I think actually changing mindsets and changing the sort of opposition that we have in public discourse around food production versus the environment is going to be one of the most difficult things. And as I was saying when I started, we are here preaching more or less, I think, to the choir, and it's all the many people outside the church that we need to be reaching out to. I think we really need to talk about the benefits to farmers of doing this. This isn't just benefits for the environment. The farmers I know who are following this kind of approach in Rushcliffe say quite simply, well, why wouldn't I be investing in my soil? It's my major asset. And I think we're getting to a stage where we're losing so much topsoil in the UK every year. It's just not sustainable that that's going to make financial sense for people in the long term. So I think we really have to get good, tight arguments around the benefits for individuals of following this approach. And also, I think, just be quite creative about how we reach out and engage with people. That's why I started up a quarterly forum as a Member of Parliament. I see myself as sort of like a go-between between the farming community in Rushcliffe and Defra and government ministers. And I think it's really important that individual Members of Parliament look at their role in doing this, because change is frightening for people. It's a change that we really have to embrace. And I think if it's one that we get right, we have a really unique opportunity in the UK to lead internationally on this issue. The gentleman over there mentioned the gene precision editing bill, which just came in. That's a fantastic thing to do. As the food system has a huge opportunity to influence climate change and biodiversity, for good or for bad, but it's also uniquely affected by the effects of climate change and biodiversity. So we have to look at making our food system more resilient to both of those. And the way that we can do that through things like gene editing and through pushing all sorts of new innovative technology around analytics, robotics, it's really important we embrace that and do all we can to draw people in.
Thank you. Now, we're going to end up now. I'm going to ask, first of all, Secretary of State to answer 3 of those questions, which are actually quite interesting because they're different aspects of how difficult what he's trying to do at the moment is. And then I'm going to ask you all briefly in a minute to answer the question, what do you think policymakers can do to accelerate the transition towards regenerative farming? So, Secretary of State, You've got one person complaining that you're going in the right direction but not fast enough. You've got someone here asking you what you're going to be doing about fuel and incentivize that, how you're going to expand the schemes. And you've got a definitional question over here, effectively telling you that you've got the definitions wrong in another area on pig feed. And it's an example of all the things that are being thrown at you. So will you answer those, maybe in the specific, but also in the general?
Sure. Well, look, farming is nothing if not complex, and the environment is complex too. So you're always going to get these sorts of dilemmas. But on Tom's specific point about the acceleration fund on technology, in fact, you'll be pleased to have discussed it with our officials this morning. He's right; it's been delayed, and that's partly because we've been trying to prioritise getting the SFI open on time for people. But we've obviously also done several rounds at the moment of farming investment funds. I'm very interested in this idea of R&D syndicates, which would be industry-led, where you'd have agronomists on some of the agribusinesses with a shared challenge coming together, getting government match funding to tackle, say, a challenge with carrot fly or something. So it's a big part of what we're doing on that technology front. And although it's not going to happen as early as Tom had hoped and we'd originally said, it will happen. On the fuels point, one of the most interesting things I've seen in the last few months is a project actually in Cornwall, a demonstration project where they've captured methane. They've got equipment to capture methane from slurry stores. They're then processing and cleaning that methane, putting it into bottles. And actually, New Holland have created a tractor that's a modified version of a standard tractor that runs on biomethane generated from a farm. This gives the farm an additional income stream. It means you haven't got the methane going into the atmosphere, so it tackles greenhouse gases, and also gives us an energy security benefit as well. So some of these sort of technologies really will come through here and address multiple challenges simultaneously. And then on the definition point, I'm making a general point, but if you look at horticulture, it is the case that, and I know that John Shropshire's in the audience, but there are businesses in this country that are big, serious agribusinesses turning over tens of millions of pounds each, often on a relatively small area of land. Look at the soft fruit industry, look at brassica veg. The output that they create and the food production that's held in the hands of a relatively small number of significant players using a relatively small amount of land is really quite substantial. And so the point holds. But it is, of course, the case, yes, pigs and poultry eat feed that's generally coming from feed wheat, and so there's some land needed for that too, and I don't deny that.
Thank you. So in 1 minute, we're just going to go through what can policymakers do to accelerate the regenerative transition. Oliver.
Well, at a time of rising costs for inputs, it should be possible to say to people, look, you can cut your inputs if you follow regenerative farming techniques. So that's one message that could be sent out. And then in terms of practical policies, I mean, if you could also point out that your crops that you plant to fix the nitrogen will be incentivized through the SFI. And then I would encourage government to get on and do a soil carbon code so that we can have the trading, the stream of income coming in from the private sector, and as has been said, blending that with the public sector support so that we really give a boost to farmers who are prepared to go down this route.
Ruth.
We need to effectively communicate the benefits of doing so. As Oliver said, input costs is a clear one at the moment. We need to accelerate the take-up of new technologies, and we need to look at case studies from industries that have undergone huge technological change themselves recently. We need to work across government. The conversation today has spanned education, transport, the Treasury, bays, and we do that, and it is difficult, as George says, it is what it is, but we need to keep pushing on with that. And we need to release private sector funding streams, so it's really important that some of the great pilots, like the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, the pilots that are happening under that are then scaled up quickly, but we need to do so in a way that builds confidence in the system.
Ian.
I hear the word technology far too often. I don't think technology is our solution. I think it offers more to the companies that sell the technology than it does to farmers. And people won't like me for saying that. I think government can bridge the gap, the finance gap, where to take the risk away from farms that seek to adopt regenerative agriculture in the same way as has been done with incentivising organic agriculture. But I think most of all, we need to have a department that understands agriculture better than it does now. We need to have a feeling of genuine partnership between farmers and the department, where we still appear to have a very regulatory relationship between the two. And I think if we really want farmers to take up regenerative agriculture, then the overwhelming future is in peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, and that's the direction that government policy should be going, rather than paid professional advisors. I think the best of the practitioners that are here today should be being used as examples to everyone else. And in many cases, it'll be the accounts that persuade the people who aren't here, and there needs to be a genuine openness where farmers are willing to explain the impact that going regenerative has had on them in a warts and all fashion, including the problems they've had along the way and how long it's taken them to get there. You talk to John and Alex today, and they will tell you they're more profitable than they've ever been, but they've had some hard times in between, and it's having that partnership to carry people through that, to give them the faith to make that leap. Otherwise, they're not going to do it.
Secretary of State.
If Ian was at the morning session, he probably was. I spent, as those of you aware knows, most of my time talking about the need for a different culture. And we've got a great opportunity now that we haven't got the risk of disallowance risk and fines from the EU and all of the IAC sort of regulatory process that we were obliged to follow, to do things quite differently, to make space for innovation, to accept that failure is part of the environment, and sometimes things can be tried and don't always work. There's a great chance we've got to do that, and events like this are a great way of sharing knowledge. But it's also the case. So the Farmers Weekly, I've noticed, have started doing quite a regular feature on regenerative agriculture and different approaches that different people are trialling. So I think there is an openness to this in the farming industry. We've got over 30,000 farmers already engaged with countryside stewardship. We're a long way along this road already, and we just need to keep working and building on what we've started.
Thank you. It feels as though there's potentially a whole other session to be had on exactly the nature of the support for farmers and how that works and how they're trained, and that clearly is going to be a huge part of a successful transition. I'd love to thank my panel today, but also to you in the audience who are the reason that we've even got as far as we had, because we've got pioneers and people who've showed that this approach can work. So thank you very much.